Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to gain full control over Udachne on the western flank of Pokrovsk after months of fighting. The fighting will now expand beyond the town onto the western supply lines leading into the city of Pokrovsk. The Russians have also managed to gain full control over Plavni in the western outskirts of the Zaporizhia region and even break through into the town of Snefnohirsk on the northern flank of Plavni along the river line. Starting out in the western outskirts of the Zaporizhia region, the Russians have managed to break through the defensive lines of the Ukrainians past Plavni onto the rear of Snefnohirsk, where the Ukrainians launched a counterattack to displace the Russian forces, managing to enter deep into the Ukrainian territories. From this, we can see that the Russians have managed to gain control over Plavni, and they have managed to infiltrate the western parts of Snefnohirsk, but they have not yet stabilized their positions and consolidated their positions here on the western outskirts. Despite the failure to capture the apartment complex area south of Snefnohirsk, the Russians have managed to advance along the river line itself, getting closer to the defensive line and the rear of the defensive line located here in the Zaporizhia region. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the fortified positions, the town of Snefnohirsk and Primorske on the bank of the river line along the Dnieper river line towards the second line of defense. Gain control over the western flank of this defensive line will allow the Russians to start fighting over the defensive line from the western flank, similar to the operations of the Russians on the eastern flank of the defensive lines, where they can advance from both the eastern and western flanks to gain control over the fortified positions. Gain control over the initial parts is achievable by the Russian forces, while the second part is much more difficult because the river line separating the northern and southern parts is much more apparent, it's much wider and more difficult to pass through, while the fortifications are also much more layered and more difficult to push through, and the vicinity to Zaporizhia city becomes very close at that point. While the first line of defense, there are still some weaknesses in the Ukrainian defenses, which allows the Russians to push through. At the very least, the Russians may look to gain control over the western parts of the first defensive line leading up to Udachne to push with a combined force from the east, south, and west, gain control over the defensive line and gain control over Udachne to then push through along the defensive line towards Udachne, where they can connect with the forces in the east. In the direction of Udachne, the Russians have managed to gain full control over the settlement. This has allowed them, following months of fighting, to start the battle over the industrial area just north of Udachne, gaining control over which will open the road for the Russians to cut off the last highway connection, which is the E50 highway to the northwest of Pokrovsk. With the fighting near Rodinske and now the fighting near the industrial area, the Russians are looking to physically cut off the two main supply routes that remain for the Ukrainian forces, both within Pokrovsk and Melnirad, leaving just Udachne as the sole remaining supply line for their forces, which would be under Russian fire control at that point. This means that the Ukrainians are at their last defensive positions before an operational encirclement of Pokrovsk takes into full effect, which will severely complicate the supply of the Ukrainian forces within the two cities and improve the logistics for the Russian forces. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.